So welcome everyone to Prosecutors 101. Please note that this webinar will be available on the ChangeLawyers YouTube channel in a few days. And like I said earlier, my name is Carlos. I use he and they pronouns, and I'm the Chief Content Director at ChangeLawyers. And if you all don't know ChangeLawyers, we are a legal foundation, and we believe in change makers and in funding the next generation of change makers, including the next generation of reform-minded prosecutors. Now, before we begin, I do want to send love out to everyone joining us today. The election is 1 week away, and as of 2020 hasn't been more than overwhelming already. And in fact, I personally feel overwhelmed constantly from everything that's happened this year. And yet I remain grateful for everyone in this room, grateful that we get to create this space together and talk about these issues, particularly right now with the climate that we're living in. And so I just want to set a intention for the space for the next hour and for any space that ChangeLawyer hosts. We value honesty and vulnerability and emotions. And above everything else, we value your identities, whatever they may be. And so as we're about to embark on this workshop together, I invite all of you to share your experiences as you listen in the chat box and in the Q&A box. Get to know each other, learn from each other, find your people. And at the end of the hour, we're gonna leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. Now, today's event is actually a special event. It's the first in a three-part series on prosecutors and mass incarceration. This three-part series was co-developed with Hillary from For the People, which is an organization that is one of our partners at ChangeLawyers. And we're really, really happy to work with For the People because of everything they represent, they are a Black women-led and founded organization, and the work that they're doing is truly living into what we mean by reform prosecutors. So with that in mind, I just want to give a quick introduction to everyone who will be here today. So your moderator is going to be Hillary Blount from For the People, and as I said, Hillary founded For the People. They're a new organization, and they support prosecutors in re-evaluating past sentences and facilitating release of incarcerated people serving unjust sentences. Speaking from a personal experience, ChangeLawyers funded 2 summer fellows at For the People this past summer, and they learned so much, and we were so grateful that For the People provided that opportunity for those young law students to open their eyes about the potential in the reform prosecutor movement. Also joining you today will be Adam Foss. Many of you might know Adam. He is the founder of Prosecutor Impact. But before that, he was an ADA in Suffolk County, district attorneys in Boston, Massachusetts. He's been a fierce advocate of criminal justice reform and the importance of the role that the prosecutor can play in ending mass incarceration. He believes that this profession is ripe for reinvention, requiring better incentives and more measured metrics for success beyond simply cases won. And that's what led Adam to found Prosecutor Impact. You'll also be hearing from Yoel Hale from ACLU of Northern California. He is a criminal justice program manager with the ACLU of Northern California. And in this capacity, he manages a statewide network of local organizations in 11 of the largest California counties to hold elected district attorneys accountable and end mass incarceration. And you'll also be hearing from someone who's day in and day out working in a DA's office, Venus Johnson. Venus is a California native, born and raised here in Oakland. I'm in Oakland as well. And Venus currently serves as a chief ADA in the Contra Costa County DA's office under the leadership of Attorney General Diana Beckham. And in part 3 of this series, on November 10th, you'll actually be hearing from DA Beckham herself as well. Venus is the second in command, so shout out Venus. It's great to see women like you in this position. And she advises the DA and assumes the role in her absence. So with that, I'd like to invite all of our panelists to turn on their video. and get the conversation going. And just a reminder, folks, throughout the conversation, drop your questions in the chat box, and they will be more than happy to answer at 12:45. So with that in mind, Hillary, take it away.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, ChangeLawyers, for creating this space for us to have this important conversation, especially on the heels of or in advance of the election. And as everybody tuning in here knows, there is so much at stake with this upcoming election. And thankfully, criminal justice reform is front and center in this conversation. And we are obviously all thrilled that it is front and center. But we wanted to spend a little bit of time digging a little deeper into the reform movement, into possibly an area that some of you may not be as familiar with, and that's prosecutors. So many people have said, and I think that many of us agree, that prosecutors have tremendous power. And so we want to get right into it and talk about how do we harness this power so that we can use and engage prosecutors to be part of the solutions to ending mass incarceration. And I am just so thrilled that I have my friends here today to talk about this. I have the luxury of knowing all of them and quite familiar with them. So we're just going to get right into it. We're going to keep it real. We're not going to beat around the bush because there's too much to talk about and too much on the line. So with that, I want to start with ladies first. Hashtag Black Girl Magic, hashtag Trust Black Women. And I want to start with Venus. So getting right into it, you're a Black woman. You are from Oakland. You have seen then and know now, you know, that the criminal justice system has not treated Black folks and people of color fairly. And so my question to you is, you know, in your lived experiences in growing up in Oakland, what made you decide to be a prosecutor versus an advocate, a public defender? Why did you choose that path?
Muted, Venus.
Thank you. I'm just
going. I know. Come on, Hillary.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. Anyway, I was saying it is such a pleasure to be here today. My girl Hillary, such an honor to see you moderating this platform and doing the work you're doing. Adam, as always, it's wonderful to connect as we have many times over the past few years. And Yoel, the local work that the ACLU and our office and meeting and doing together is really instrumental. So it's just a privilege to be on this panel today. So thank you. But to get right to the meat of the question, Hillary, I am the daughter of an immigrant. I am the daughter of a law enforcement officer who served the Oakland Police Department as a correctional officer for many years. And I was born and raised in Oakland. And so I think seeing from my vantage point growing up, harm that was caused in my community, the victims, the Black and brown children that were innocent kids, subject to gun violence, subject to, unfortunately, just a lot of as we know, the harm that was being caused in our communities in the 80s and the 90s. The question, as you asked, why not become a public defender? Why not be an advocate? I felt my place was as a prosecutor. There weren't many people that looked like me. The only person that I knew that looked like me that was doing the work was Kamala Harris. That was it. And it was fascinating to me that a Black woman, that a woman of color was in the space she was in, doing the work she was doing, advocating for reform at such a time where these conversations weren't happening when I joined the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. The climate was different. I also felt like, if not me, then who? If I wasn't at the table, then who was going to bring my perspective to the table? Who was going to understand the communities? I grew up in Deep East Oakland. So I don't know many people who became prosecutors who grew up in that community with a Black father who grew up in West Oakland, who was fed by the Black Panthers for their morning breakfast, but who also decided to become a part of law enforcement in his community. And so I felt like I had something to offer. I felt like my perspective was important. And I felt like the people who walked in our courtroom needed to see people who looked like me sitting at the table, making decisions that would impact the rest of their life.
Well, that's a good reason and quite necessary. I want to turn to take us across the country to the other side of the country, to the East Coast, to Adam, who I'm just actually realizing this now that both of you had law enforcement in your family. Pops was law enforcement for both of you. So Adam, I want to ask you the same question. Pops was law enforcement, Black men in America. What made you decide, and was there a time that you thought, you know what, maybe I'm better, my path is actually better to pursue as a public defender? Like, did you ever grapple with that before you made the decision to be a prosecutor?
Yeah. First, just want to say thanks to ChangeLawyers, this amazing organization doing great work. And second, just want to say the obvious thing, which is I'm on a panel with 4 Black people talking about prosecution. And when I started in law school, this would never have been a thing. And so that is, to me, proof that we are on the right track. I was very disconnected from sort of like my dad's job and what I wanted to do in my life, and it didn't really come back around until I was in law school. And to answer your question, I never imagined being anything except for a public defender after I saw firsthand the racial disparity, the harm being caused by our system, the violence in the community that I was clerking in law school as a law clerk, and thought that I would be best to serve that community as a public defender. And it wasn't until maybe sort of like Venus that I met other Black prosecutors who were like, no, if you want to do something, come here. And I did so with a combination of a chip on my shoulder and a ton of skepticism. But look at that decision to come to this job as one of the best that I've ever made. And I've committed sort of the rest of my life to making this profession better. And so it's really, really interesting to now be having conversations with my dad now, who's actually a white guy, Republican. I was adopted. And so the conversations that we have now about law enforcement, about our criminal justice system, are really, really interesting, and maybe wouldn't have been the same if I had tried to have them when I was in law school trying to figure my way through it.
I want to follow up with you, Adam, on that question. You spent a ton of time in the DA's office, and I think Venus has some similar stories about, and I want to go back to Venus and ask her about this, but you were able to, while you were in the job, figure out ways to use your power and really use your discretion to sort of change the trajectory of people's lives, right? So we know that there's, names of people who will say that your intervention actually helped them to deter them from sort of this downward spiral. So you had kind of figured out how to do it in the office. So why did you leave?
Why did I leave? I got the opportunity to talk about our job on a pretty national platform. And if for any of you who have been prosecutors before, who are currently working or interning in prosecutors' offices, you know that there's a pretty tight lid on who's allowed to say things out in the open. And typically that rolls up to the elected DA or the press secretary. And I was neither one of those things, but felt that it was time to sort of tell the secret that this job, this profession, the opportunity that we have, could be used to bring about change. And when I got back to my office after doing that, I was welcomed back with basically an ultimatum. You can stay here and you can go back to being a real prosecutor by putting cases in the grand jury, trying cases, or and you can do that, but all the programs that you've started, all your community engagement, all that speaking comes to an end, or you can go follow this dream of yours to change the system. And so I left. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. I think I'm, like I'm the biggest, I hang out with prosecutors all the time because have FOMO, and look forward to getting back to the job, but it wasn't something that I wanted to do.
So a little theme emerging around staying in your lane. Speaking of which, I want to turn to Yoel. You have a very unique lane, largely one that I think that you were kind of part of the original pioneers of this. I remember meeting you years ago when the DA reform conversation wasn't as popular as it is now. And I think that back then, many activists and advocates would say, we have a lane that we're in, and working with DAs, that's not one of them. But you've been doing that for a while, and I want to know from you, why did you see that as a lever, and why do you continue to do that work today?
Yeah. Thank you for having us today, and it's great to just be in conversation with people like I've worked with over the last year. So this is exciting. For me, by the way, Venus, I'm also in Deep East. I'm in the 80s. So I didn't know that about you. But for me, when we were starting, like when I was brought on to the ACLU to kind of like work on prosecutorial accountability, like we started focusing on prosecutors back in 2010 and then in 2014, just because our election cycle is on the California gubernatorial election. And it really started because, as an outgrowth of our work to abolish the death penalty, right? And, as we were like fighting that fight on the ballot, we kind of started to see, okay, we're dealing with it here after the fact, but there are like people who are making these decisions in the first place who nobody's looking at, right? And it kind of grew from that. And then we've had a couple of ballot measures in California to kind of change like 3 strikes laws, change certain low-level felonies into misdemeanors. Some of these reforms that were just not getting done through the legislative process. So they went to the ballot and to the public. And all the prosecutors except 1 or 2 would categorically oppose any and all reforms, and then they would pass by the voters, and then it would be back to the people who opposed them to implement the very things that they had opposed. And this from like your Prop 47 work, Hillary. And what we started to do, I think at that time what we were starting to realize is, if we trace the genesis of policing to slave catchers, right, and the genesis of prison guards to slave overseers, the prosecutors are like literally the bridge that connects those 2, right? And if we really wanted to tackle mass incarceration, it wasn't like they had to be part of that conversation, right? And that they have to be like an elected official that they are, that these prosecutors' offices have to have, like, there has to be shed a light on them. We have to be able to look at all the choice points that exist, all the different choices that they were making. And until we really do that, it would be difficult to try to address mass incarceration on the back end if you're not dealing with it on the front end. So what that kind of has evolved into over the last 4 years is that we've kind of developed and worked with a lot of like local organizers, people who've worked on various like criminal justice related advocacy in the past. And what has developed as a core project for us and for all of our partners is like a real sustained focus on prosecutors over time to really look at what are they charging? Why are people getting all these like inordinate sentences? Why is it that black people are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated on any given county in any given place in this country, right? And I think through that, I think we've been able to develop a real capacity amongst, many advocates to look at the prosecutor's offices in depth, figure out what specific interventions, policy, or law can have the greatest impact in reducing the number of people who are charged in the first place, right? Who should really go elsewhere to get the services that they need, who are like the number of people who are actually charged, and what is the appropriate sentence or accountability measure for the various harms that do happen, that do need to be addressed holistically, right? By not figuring out ways to make sure that incarceration is just not going to be the solution to every little social conflict or like harm that happens.
Let me ask you a follow-up question to that. You know, you've heard from Venus and Adam that, you know, there was a little side eye from some folks when we decided to make this career choice. I definitely experienced that when I went into the DA's office. Does that happen to you? Like, is there some side eye about like, why are you working with DAs? And, you know, your role is to be on the outside, you know, protesting and demanding things, not necessarily going into the office and sitting around a conference table talking about solutions.
Not really, and partially because it might be because I was never a prosecutor. But you know, I think for us, the role really that I play is really to be on the side of like the community. And it's not to say that the prosecutor's office and the community are like, it's not a mutually exclusive thing, right? It's not to say necessarily that it's an either or, but it is true that like the people I work with day in, day out, they are formerly incarcerated. They are the people who got screwed over by the prosecutor's offices, who, you know, who were told during their sentencing hearing and during their, you know, prosecution of their case, DAs who are now singing like reform language, like 20 years ago, were calling them in the courthouse, "You're the worst human being to ever exist. You have no chance of redemption. We never want to see you, and we'll try to give you as many years as we possibly can," while their parents are sitting in the court, right? And now these people have done incredible amount of work. They're leading community-based organizations, and they're trying to prevent that from happening to other people by a younger generation of prosecutors. And my role has been to really figure out what is happening in a specific community. So I'll give you an example, right? In one of the counties that we work with, the thing that they experience most often is that these prosecutors will give like young adults, right, 17, 16 to like 24, they'll get charged with something, they'll come, and the DAs will say, you know, take a strike and you can go home today, right? Or don't take a strike and, you know, your case will just be resolved through whatever means, right? And but what that means is that you're going to stay in jail, like unless you can afford bail, and most people can't, right? And you're going to get whatever sentence, right? Well, even if it's 2 years, whatever, right? And you give, you know, they give you this option, and any rational person is going to be like, I would rather take the strike and not be imprisoned for the next 2 years, right? But the insidiousness of that is what the prosecutors are actually doing is that they're banking on this kid being arrested for a minor thing like 2 months later, right? And then you're going to have a strike prior and they can give you another 5-year enhancement, right? And this is the thing that's happening. And so when we're hearing about these cases, like the role that like we've been playing is, okay, let's figure this out. Let's go to the DA and say, look, can you tell your DAs, if you think a kid is safe enough to go out to the community, why does he have to go with a strike, right? Like, what is it that you're calculating here? He's not a safety risk. You're letting him go, obviously, right? What is the benefit to society, to the kid, to anybody to send him with a strike on the assumption that when he comes back, you can send him longer, right? And so because the role I play has been figuring out what are the pain like points for the community and what specific things can the DA do to eliminate those pain points, and then try to actually make that happen with a lot of resistance from a lot of DAs, is I haven't been able to, I don't get that, just because I think I am trying to be on the people's side and trying to address their pain points and not kind of be the source of the pain as a lot of like DA's offices are, unfortunately.
Right. And I think that that's a important, I mean, this is, you know, you're speaking from, you know, people's real experiences, stories that mothers tell you, that children tell you about their parents. And I think that this, you know, ties back to this critical nature of having an Adam or a Venus, because it's these daily decisions that are being made that can really change everything. So I want to go to Venus on that topic. You know, we kind of have we have the advantage right now of not being in the DA's office, and I definitely can look in and have all types of ideas about exactly what should happen and you should make this decision. But I also remember being at the DA's office and those moments of just not knowing what to do, and also feeling just a lot of tugs from different directions. And so, Adam and I have been talking about this a lot, that who does the DA answer to? Like, who do prosecutors answer to? Is it the victims? Is it the defendants? Is it the community that's marching in the street? Is it legislators? Is it just follow the law? I think that one of the things that we've been hearing from prosecutors, line prosecutors especially, is that there's so many people that feels like are the audience, or the person to whom their allegiance is supposed to be. So with all of that coming at you, Venus, how do you navigate all of that? And also, with all of your insight about what needs to happen to the system, how do you navigate that and move this forward? Small job.
Oh, that is the question of the century. And the short answer is we're responsible to all of those people and entities. And, I think historically, district attorneys' offices and law enforcement, in this, at least in the state of California, I can speak to, there was a real movement around, rightfully so, victims having voice, victims getting justice, getting restitution, redemption, being made whole, all of those things. And that movement really, I think went on to kind of shape probably a lot of practices and policies, I think, at least in California. And now that we have the reform movement that has really entered the picture, finding the space for both of those things is where the tension lies. I have always been a person of the community. I know my community. I love my community. I understand my community. But I also know my job. I also understand the laws and the parameters that I can act within and cannot, and where, for lack of a better word, I don't have power to do certain things, but there are lots of places where I have power to do certain things. And so it has really been the balance of, one, trying to continue to educate those externally and internally, that you are not solely to answer to one single entity, right? And I know it's kind of cliche, but Hillary, you know this very well. Adam, you go into the courtroom and we stand up and we say, Venus Johnson, Hillary Blount, Adam Foss, for the people. The people means everyone, including the defendant, including the person accused and charged, including that person's family, including that person's community. And our job is really to weigh and balance all of those factors together. And it is why the role of the district attorney is so important and so powerful, because to do it right, and I'm not saying we get it right every day, but to attempt to do it right, you have to look at all of those things. Inevitably, you're not going to make, someone is going to be unhappy. Someone is going to not understand. It may be internally, it may be externally. But to Yoel's point, again, about who is sitting in those decision-making seats, if the community is wanting and demanding and calling for reform, it's really important that the person sitting in that elected seat is receptive to hearing that message, can sit down and say, I hear you, I empathize with you. Let me explain to you where my challenge is, and let's see how we can build a bridge or a path to make this work, to make this better. It could be a simple fix by the elected to say we're not going to engage in this practice anymore. It could be a legislative fix because something in the law is maybe preventing the DA from acting or binds the DA's hands, which is why I think, having the role of propositions in the legislature and the community and all of those things are extremely, extremely important. But my job is to not answer to one person or one entity. No, it is to do the right thing for that specific case and for the system as we look to reform it and change it. In some instances, just dismantle certain parts of it and rebuild it anew. And working with organizations as well, like yours and ChangeLawyers, to to figure out how do we make this system better for and give everyone a voice. And the last thing I will just say, there are many organizations and many folks working with victims advocates, victim rights, who actually are displeased with the traditional role of prosecutors. They are displeased with just the punishment.
Say it.
That does not change behavior. Every single person is a human being. Every single person is capable of redemption. That is the thing I think we have to remember. It is not my job to label you the worst person that has walked this earth. You are, a critter, a thug, whatever the label is you want to give individuals. And the thing that I think I learned from my father, from him growing up and being raised in Oakland and in a Black community in West Oakland, is that irrespective of his job, I saw my father treat every single person with respect. We would see people on the street that he had, encountered in his job, hey, officer such and such, hey, how's it going? And I'd be like, Daddy, you treat everyone from the janitor to who you are placing handcuffs on, to the chief or whoever else is, with the same level of respect, because we are all human beings deserving of that. And so that is the lens that I come to the work with.
I want to, not everybody comes to the work with that lens, Venus.
I know.
And, I have to say that when I started the work that I do, I believed that there are, in fact, prosecutors out there, elected and line prosecutors, that do come to the work with that lens, even if they don't identify themselves as a reform prosecutor, or they didn't support Prop 47, but they have a lens and I had my own sort of enlightenment experience that helped me to get to where I am today. And so, that's really what, from my perspective, what the work is, a big part of it. And so I want to ask you, Adam, you've just heard Venus talk about, being able to have an elected that you can, make recommendations to, and that's receptive to this lens that Venus just described. And a lot of these organizations out here are focusing, that's what I do. I focus on, working with elected prosecutors, but you have decided to also focus on line prosecutors, which is a bit of a departure, right? Because most people are working with the elected, the decision maker, but you don't do that. Can you share with us why you're focused on the line prosecutors and DA offices?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with just understanding the bureaucracy of a DA's office and understanding that that person that's sitting on the top is in many ways the least important person. That person, in my mind, doesn't even really need to be a lawyer because of the amount that their job requires them to understand the law and make decisions about the law is so little compared to the amount of time that they're managing, leading, setting culture, incentivizing people, inspiring people, communicating with people. None of those skills are really things that we pick up in law school, frankly. The decision makers, the people who are either contributing to or ameliorating the effects of mass incarceration, are not the DA. It's not Steve, who's been in the office for 30 years and is trying 10 murder cases a year. It is Adam, the 28-year-old prosecutor who's fresh out of law school, who's sitting in an arraignment session and churning through 100 cases on a Monday of all the people who were arrested over the course of that weekend. And while they are not decisions like, should this person be charged with first-degree murder or second-degree murder, should this person get the death penalty or not, they are decisions like, should I ask for $500 bail or no bail? And in many, many ways, we as an institution, we as a system, should understand that that decision made in the aggregate hundreds of times a day across 2,400 offices all over the country, and thank you, Julie, for putting it into the chat. We're not even talking about the AUSAs, the city solicitors, other folks who have sort of a prosecutorial function who are also making lots of these decisions. That is really where the problem begins and ends. Those people are in front of the public way more often than the DA. The decisions that they're making in the aggregate are again causing a grievous amount of harm or really reducing barriers to that harm. And the fact that we let those folks learn how to do their job on the job says everything that you need to know about our system. And no other system would we allow fresh, new, like ignorant, green, scared decision makers to make really important decisions about the lives of other people if those other people weren't Black and brown and poor and marginalized. And the culture that we are a part of, and I see somebody on here from the American Bar Association. I'm really glad to see you here, because I think a lot of this really has to do with the culture that begins in law school. The idea that we don't even bat an eye when we ask people, why are you going to the DA's office? To get trial experience. What? Don't come here to practice a skill on the lives of other human beings. This idea that like winning is the metric of success, and being a great trial attorney is great when nobody has ever actually validated through like research or data that like a trial leads to safety. In fact, for the people who have put cases in front of juries, we all know how much of a pageant that is, and how it has much more to do with like how we feel than how the survivor feels or how the defendant feels. And so both for the reasons that I just don't think that the person who sits at the top of the office is the person who is making the decisions that we're really talking about. But there's also a generational thing. And this is really where like I get optimistic about our future, because I feel that the way that our profession survived for all of this time without like the urgency to stop and ask, like, are we really doing a good job? Are we everything that we say we are? Are we doing like justice? Are we helping victims? Like, we've never once been forced to like visit any of those things and be like, show me the evidence. We're a bunch of lawyers that build cases on evidence, except when it comes to whether or not we're doing a good job at our work. We say things like, we serve victims. Well, if you just like scratch at the surface of the data, what we find out is what Venus has already said is like, the vast majority of victims hate us. They don't want anything to do with us. And we can do what I was conditioned to do, which is blame that on the victims. They don't care about their communities. They listen to too much rap music. They don't have any respect in their homes. Snitch culture. Or I can do what I was trained to do as a bartender, oddly enough, which is just like, hey, people are not coming into our front door. What do we have to do to change to make that happen? And none of that was ever sort of like part of our conditioning or part of our culture and the DA's office. And I really honestly think it was because of social media. It is very easy to convince me of the truth of this thing by forcing me to like learn this culture through internships and through law school if I don't have another data set to look against. But we have a generation of people who in the last 10 years have come out of law school with their own information about mass incarceration, about policing, about criminal justice, about mass incarceration. And because of that, you have people coming to this job, not sort of like self-discovering in the middle of the job how much power I have and what I can do with it, but people who are signing up for this job because they know that they can go be a Venus or a Hillary. And that, combined with some other stuff, has really created this urgency that you and I talk about all the time, that like, it's very difficult to find those prosecutors who are like, yeah, we're doing a great job. They exist. They are aging and dying. Unfortunately, they because of who they are and because of our supremacist culture, they hold a disproportionate amount of power around the culture of our institution. But every month that goes by, and we host conversations with prosecutors, young and old, frankly, who are seeing people out in the street really demanding something different. Being forced to, and in many ways being inspired by this demand for change, and being the masters of their own destiny, being the architects of their own future. And that's why I love doing something like this, where it's literally just like, this is the bench, this is the army. And that's why I think I've chosen to focus exclusively on the line staff.
Can I add to that, Hillary? Because like what Adam raises, especially about like the younger attorneys being actually responsible for a disproportionate number of cases. Like, so we have recently done a lot of PRAs to get data about prosecution, right? And it's, you know, the calendar years of 2017 and 2018, and we've already done the analysis of 3 counties so far. And across the board, across 3 counties, and we believe this is probably across the rest of the state, is over 60%, and in some cases 70% of the cases that are prosecuted, that are charged by these offices, are misdemeanors, right? Which are by definition like low-level offenses, right? And within that, you know, there's a recent policy that Dave Becton's and Venus's office just released, just about saying these offenses are too low level. We're just not going to look at them anymore, right? And the category of low level offenses that are just better not dealt with, they should not be charged, like, frankly, right? They should be decriminalized. That category of offenses makes up for almost 25% of the charges that are brought, right? 1 in 4 cases that they're bringing forward are things that some places are saying, we're just not going to charge anymore, right? And so the importance of, like, that point Adam was making is that, but you have all these, like, baby DAs making all these decisions for all these cases, which are a huge resource waste for the county, huge resource waste for, like, the DA's office, for the public defenders, the courts, to deal with, like, vandalism, petty theft, and other, like, irrelevant, like, things, right? And just saying that we're not going to charge these will actually reduce the workload of the entire DA's office by a quarter, right? Then when you add other offenses that could be diverted, like pre-plea and all these things, we're looking at numbers that are like nearly 50% of the entire caseload of DA's offices in this state are actually things that could not be charged or that could be diverted. So then, like, you have to ask yourself and look at it, if we actually implemented these, what are these 50% of people doing in this office, right? If they want trial experience, they can go somewhere else where they can get trial experience, but you're just looking at a number of people and positions that don't really become necessary.
I want to ask a question kind of that ties in a bit about what all of you have said. What I'm hearing you say, and I've heard you say, and I know you've been pushing for this for a while, is the decriminalization of low-level offenses and diverting these, sort of creating an off-ramp so they don't even get into the justice system. And I think that for myself and Venus and Adam, I remember prosecuting low-level offenses. I remember feeling like this is just not something that was a good use of anybody's time or resources. But when we look at the prison system, right, at least here in California, we've done a pretty good job of getting folks out of prison who are serving sentences for low-level offenses. And the majority of people that we have in our prison are there for offenses categorized as serious and violent. So what do we do about that? And the other thing, and this is a multi-part question, but you all are smart and can handle it, is that, yes, there are victims that have been not pleased with the way that their cases have been handled, but there are also victims out there that look to the DA's office to protect them and to guide them through this process, and get very nervous and scared about releases that are happening, or the notion that somebody may not get a severe penalty. And so how do we address, like, if we are able to decriminalize a significant portion of offenses, that still leaves the majority of offenses of people that are in prison. How do we address that? And how do we also address the fact that there are, in fact, victims that lean on DA offices to help them feel safe and help guide them through this process? So Venus, I'll start with you on that.
I'll take the second question first. You said, how do we help victims feel safe? I think you have to ask, what does safety mean? Safety is going to mean something very different depending on the victim, depending on the case, depending on the offense. We in Contra Costa launched, I supervised the juvenile unit, and so we launched earlier this year a restorative justice program. The first in the history of the Office for Juveniles, for youth, whereby, right, the person harmed is included in the decision making and in the process and in the prong of this young person has committed a harm, has committed an offense. There is an opportunity for this young person to perhaps get resources, think about the harm that they've caused, think about harm that has been caused to them that perhaps, right, caused them to hurt you or their community or some, you know, some other entity in our community. Would you be interested in participating in this in some form, way, or fashion? It could be via letter. It could be in person. You don't even have to participate at all. Maybe you just want to know that this young person has gone through this program and this process, and that is enough for you. It's not a one size fits all. And so when we get to talking about folks serving the longer sentences that we're really talking about, we're probably sentenced in the 80s and 90s at this point to a lot of these lengthier sentences. Our office at least has taken the position that there are cases that are worthy of revisiting. There are cases that are worthy of looking back to say, knowing what we know now, knowing what we know today, would this person receive this same sentence if he or she were prosecuted under our model of reform, under our administration, what we, you know, what our mission statement is, what our values are, and including the victim in that process or person harmed is extremely important. But we have learned from talking to folks in some of these cases that the person has served enough time. We get clemency letters from the governor's office or petitions, you know, to reduce sentences. We reach out to victims all of the time. It is part of what I do almost 5 days a week. I'm talking to someone in my office about some case, and someone is trying to seek some type of relief. And the families are like, you know, it's been 20 years, it's been 30 years, and some of the sentences are disproportionate to the harm caused. When you look back and see robberies or burglaries, at least from Contra Costa that we've seen, I mean, folks getting, you know, 80 years to life, stacking things, right? Because DAs had the ability to do that in California. I mean, you know, certain things that were mandatory at one time, but are no longer, maybe they're discretionary now. Again, I go back to redemption. I go back to treating people as human beings and really thinking about what we want our communities to look like in the future and how can we be part of the solution.
Yeah, I think that I'll take it on the front end. The question about how do we deal with violent crime differently, because we're not gonna be able to get by mass incarceration without dealing with it and leaning squarely into it. And in fact, I kind of reject a lot of the words that we've labeled this movement reform and progressive. It's just like, you know, not holding someone on pretrial detention who shouldn't be there, to me, is not a progressive move. Decriminalizing marijuana when 12 states are making Chads very rich by selling marijuana is not progressive. Not executing people when we're one of the only countries on the planet to do it is not progressive. Not incarcerating women and children is not progressive. It is, you know, across the world, it's pretty basic. So violence is another one of those things. We are the only country in the world that deals with violence in the way that we do. That to me says that there's something about our culture that we need to revisit. And again, this goes back to preparing lawyers to have conversations with people who are from communities that they don't live in about safety. If I've never experienced anything that felt like unsafety in my life, except for watching like Unsolved Mysteries with my dad, then I'm going to have a very hard time talking about safety to a person who has lived in nothing but poverty and violence and trauma. And so really like preparing us to have hard conversations about expectations around what we can provide, having the cultural awareness to understand that my not wanting to participate in the prosecution does not have to do with how much I value my life or my community. And in fact, I'm considering lots of other factors that you have no idea what I'm dealing with. Dangling services in front of people for their participation in prosecution. I think about being a domestic violence prosecutor, and the victims of my case is saying, "Yo, I need housing, I need a job, I need transitional assistance." Am I saying, "Dope, like if you just come up here and testify against this dude, I can get you all those things"? What a shitty customer service organization to do that to people who have been harmed. And so really understanding that the interventions to violence that we have in lots of ways cause more violence. The buildings that we built to hold on to people who have caused violence. We don't have to ask too many people to know, including the people who've been inside of them, that that's not fixing the problem. And so the way that I think that the most salient way that I can answer the question is twofold. One is understanding that every time there is a violent act, instead of focusing on the person who caused it and punishing them and shaming them, and focusing on the person who is the direct recipient of that harm, understanding that violence acts much more like a contagious disease than the individual moral failings of an individual. And having some humanity and dignity and empathy that violence is often the manifestation of harm that's been done to another person does not make you a weak or lenient prosecutor. It makes you a really smart one that might lead to outcomes that don't involve further perpetration of harm. And the best way that we can prevent violence is by understanding that a lot of that, the manifestation of violence that we see that is really problematic, particularly in young adults, is caused because when they were victims the first time around, we didn't treat them as such. And this goes right back to our conversation about who we serve as victims. The most victimized person in our country when it comes to serious violent crime are Black men between the ages of 18 and 25 years old. And I know that when my boss, Daniel Patrick Conley III, was out there on his stump talking about we're here to serve victims, he was not talking about young Black men from 18 to 25. In fact, when he was out there on the stump saying those things, we were doing nasty things in the grand jury to get those victims to come and testify. So prevention through young people, and then understanding that when someone commits a violent act, that while we may feel the need to punish them and hold them accountable as part of the process of getting them through that event, we also have to just have a much higher emotional intelligence to understand that we can still treat them with humanity and dignity and get better outcomes on the other side. And we can do that by including people who have committed harm as part of the team that we work with to solve those problems, and stop treating people who have committed violent crime as if they're unsalvageable pieces of trash that are that much different than us.
You know, one of the absurdities of the system is, and when I'm having conversations with my family or friends who are not from this country, I'm an immigrant here, right? Are when you're watching TV shows, like you will see things, oh, you get like 3 consecutive life sentences, and people are like, what's that mean? Like, you die, you come back to life, you get another life sentence, you die, you come back. You know, it's completely unfathomable to anybody who's not from this country. I mean, it's unfathomable to people here too, but it just simply does not exist in other places, right? And I think to your point, Hillary, is like, we have to actually have real conversations about what is the appropriate maximum punishment, right? Like, there's research that shows a 20-year sentence should be like the maximum sentence, right? Like, you're looking at 180 years as a sentence. Like, what does that even mean, right? It's completely like out of this world, right? And I think part of the conversation that has to happen is like, yeah, when harm happens, like accountability is critical, right? Because like, you have to make people whole, and you can't just pretend things didn't happen, like across everyone, right? But what does it even mean to sentence a person to like 3 life sentences, right? Like, what is, like, even if the worst thing happens or whatever, you know, like what is the actual like maximum punishment that we should be really thinking about, that only exists in this country, that don't really exist elsewhere, right? I just codified into the law, right? And if, like Venus and Adam, like all of us are saying, if we really believe people are redeemable, what does it say about us to sentence people to years that they're not even going to be alive for? You know what I'm saying? Even if they were to be reborn 5 times, they'll still be in prison. Like, what is that, right?
Right, right. Well, let's turn to the questions and just dovetailing on what you were all just saying. If you're a law student listening to all of this, and hopefully we haven't overwhelmed anybody and turned them away from what needs to happen, and hopefully we've inspired people to see what needs to be done. What would you say to an aspiring law student that wants to pursue a career in criminal justice? Would you say, go be a public defender and here's why and here's what to do there? Would you say go be a DA? I mean, what would you say to somebody that's trying to figure out, where do I plug in with everything that needs to happen in the system?
Mhm.
And I will add a second part to that, because we have a lot of folks also asking from the perspective of non-students. So if each of you can say what would be your like advice to a law student, but also what would be your advice to all the lawyers who are not prosecutors who care about this? What can they do as well?
I would say to the law students, find your passion. I think you have to find where you would fit best in the work. If it's in a prosecutor's office, I would encourage you to do your research about that prosecutor's office. Who is the DA? What kind of policies and practices? There are a number of newly elected DAs across this country. You may have to move, but really think about, if you're going to go into a prosecutor's office, I think in today's day and age, you want to go somewhere that aligns with your morals, your values, and who you are, and what you stand for. If it's being a public defender, good. We need amazing folks, and there are some brilliant minds in public defenders' offices across the country. If it is more advocacy, if it is creating a nonprofit, just do whatever your passion is. Just be true to who you are. For folks who are attorneys, who may not be criminal prosecutors or attorneys, understand your community. Figure out who your DA is. The ACLU has created this amazing, right, know your DA, movement. Understand the policies and practices and what your DA is doing. What stances have they taken on previous propositions that have been on the ballot? What things are coming out of their office? Who is holding them accountable? Call your friends who are in those offices. Call me, call Hillary, call Adam, call Yoel, and ask us our thoughts and opinions about kind of what's going on. You don't have to take our word for it, but do your homework, do your research, and be an advocate. We need the support out there. It's just as important for the movement internally, but just as important externally as well.
Yeah, retweet all of that with endorsement. I think for those, I'm going to talk to the folks who aren't interested or not thinking about a career in the quote unquote criminal justice system, to say that there is no such thing. There's not like the folks who are going to go do this work and then everybody else, because unless you believe that like policing, prosecution, and prisons are what equals safety, then there's a whole other world for you to invest in that will lead to safer outcomes than anything that we can do. Once we get folks, both because of our culture and the tools that we have, the resource that we have at our disposal, but also because of where we sit, it's really difficult for us to do the work to go back. And it's a lot of frustration that Venus and Hillary and Yoel and myself run into is prosecutors are just like, that's not my job. What am I supposed to do? I'm not a social worker. And while we can have a whole other conversation about those sort of like, I think that's sort of like quitting language. I think that's fatalist language. I think that speaks to a lack of creativity and will. But there are lots of places that you can plug in. Early childhood is like the place that we lose a lot of our people. When you sit in a prison, as I know Venus and Hillary and you all have all done, and sit with people who have caused the worst harm, sitting with men and women who have caused harm like murder. And when you sit with them and you hear about their life story, almost all of them tell you this story that is rife with lots of things that happened to them when they were little kids. And that is not just about like direct abuse that they've suffered or neglect that they've suffered, but like housing, education, nutrition, access to health, access to mental health, transportation is the difference between safety and not for a lot of folks. And so access to public transportation, our own transportation, some ridiculous amount of our cases are traffic and the access to a driver's license and insurance. And so if you want to, like, honestly, if you want to go advocate on behalf of the criminal justice system, I would really strongly urge you to stay away from the DA's office and the public defender's office. I would really urge you to get in and try to make the case that all of those things and the access to those things and the resourcing of those things and the education around those things and the connection of people to the communities in those things and being good customer service agents, being stewards of that information will much more effectively, much more efficiently, and much more humanely lead to safety than anything that you can do by the time you are making a decision about whether or not to take somebody's liberty away. And so really, really look at everyone on this call as an ally, as a civil rights leader, as someone who is working in the criminal justice system. The last thing I'll say is if there are any people out there who are like med students, lean into that shit, because there is a burgeoning sort of discipline called medical legal professionals, which like is the closest thing that I can think of like an in-person superhero who I'm a pediatrician, and I'm learning about my patient's asthma, and that asthma, because of this discipline I have, I know that asthma is leading to bad school outcomes because of everything that happens to kids with special needs at school, and because of those bad school outcomes, that young person is likely to disengage in school. And all of the people on this call know what happens when young people disengage in school. They come to us. And so that doctor, as they are there working on this kid with asthma, also learns that there's mold in the house. And so that doctor takes off her white lab coat, puts on her blazer, goes to court, and sues the landlord. Like, this is a future that I'm talking about, and I'm really excited that there are folks who are thinking about ways that they can plug in. But that's what I'll say.
So Carlos, we thought about having this be 2 hours. We could have definitely gone that long. I have like 30,000 more questions to ask. And I just also want to spend as much time with the three of you as possible. But we do have to come to a close now. I want to thank you, Adam and Venus and Yoel. You guys are the most, like, the busiest people I know. And so thank you for taking the time to have this conversation, to also just be candid and honest, and just put it all out there. I think, like we said in the beginning, there's too much on the line to beat around the bush. And so thank you for all of your honesty. And for everybody that's still on, this is a 3-part session. And so many of the questions that came up in the chat and came up in the Q&A, we hopefully will be able to cover over the next 2 sessions. The next will be a deep dive around how we got here, the through line of slavery to mass incarceration. And then our last session will be post-election with the public defender and also with an elected DA to talk about where we go from here and the opportunities ahead. So hopefully you'll join us for those. And again, thank you so much for everybody that joined us today, and go vote.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.